Welcome back to Live Now from Fox. We are continuing to follow all of the developments after a U.S. official has indicated that Ukraine has accepted a peace plan. And I did want to bring up this social media post from White House Press Secretary Caroline Leavitt saying, over the past week, the United States has made tremendous progress towards a peace deal by bringing both Ukraine and Russia to the table. There are a few delicate but not insurmountable details that must be sorted out and will require further talks between Ukraine, Russia, and the United States. I also wanted to share some video from earlier today. This as Russia struck Kyiv amid the ongoing negotiations right here. This is some video from earlier this morning. You can see some of that destruction right there. And a little bit more on that, Ukraine was the recipient of this attack that killed at least 6 people and injured 13 others. These are strikes from Russia on residential buildings and civilian infrastructure. But this does come as Russia has agreed to a peace deal that would see an end to the war with Russia. Lieutenant Colonel Jeff Tolbert, a spokesperson for the U.S. Army Secretary Dan Driscoll, had told Fox News that Driscoll and his team met with Russian officials in Abu Dhabi yesterday and today to discuss the framework for a Ukraine peace deal, saying, quote, the talks are going well and we remain optimistic. Secretary Driscoll is closely synchronized with the White House and the U.S. interagency as these talks progress. Now, the diplomatic discussions over the weekend followed the leak of the 28-point peace plan, which many European leaders and U.S. lawmakers viewed as largely favorable to Russia. However, Representative Don Bacon, a Republican from Nebraska, said the latest version, developed with Secretary of State Marco Rubio's involvement and input from Ukrainian and European officials, was a better plan. So Ukraine's decision to agree to this deal comes hours after Russia launched an overnight attack on Kyiv. Russian officials, meanwhile, have been reserved in their comments on this peace plan, and a Russian foreign minister saying earlier today that Moscow is in touch with U.S. officials about peace efforts. Joining me now is both former U.S. Ambassador to Ukraine William Taylor and Rear Admiral Mark Montgomery, who now serves as an FDD Senior Fellow, bringing both of these gentlemen on with us live right now. And we appreciate the both of you joining us here on Live Now from Fox.
Good to be here, Steph.
Thank you.
So, Ambassador Taylor, I want to begin with you because negotiations have been going on for months now. This is a first step into obtaining actual peace. Can you shed some light, though, on the specific timing of Ukraine agreeing to this peace plan?
Well, Stephanie, as you indicated, there was real concern about the 28-point plan that was very clearly coming out of the Russians, leaked by the Russians as well. And that was then modified. As you said, Secretary Rubio got involved and good conversations with the Ukrainians and the Europeans. And that got down to something like 18 or 19 points that apparently now the Ukrainians have signed on to with a couple of caveats. But that is real progress. So it seems like the Ukrainians, Americans, and Europeans are very close to an agreement. And then the question is going to be, will the Russians come on board? Your point out about pressure is important. It's going to be important to pressure Putin to come to the table to agree to this deal.
And let's talk about that, Rear Admiral Montgomery. Overnight, Russia launched a series of attacks against Kyiv as these negotiations are going on. They've been reserved in terms of what they're sharing, where their mindset is. You know, what do these overnight attacks indicate to you? And as these peace negotiations continue for them, could we see more of these attacks?
Well, you know, the attacks were 400 drones, 20 cruise missiles, 7 dead Ukrainians. What I would call that is, unfortunately, a normal Tuesday night in Ukraine, and this is a real problem. You know, the Russians are continuing their unrestricted warfare against the Ukrainian people and the Ukrainian critical infrastructure. This was mostly against energy infrastructure, the attacks last night. So what I would say is, you know, Russia is unconstrained. Russia does not feel pressured. And my take is that until Russia feels pressure, real pressure, that can really only be inflicted by the United States, they're probably not going to relax these nightly attacks, and they're certainly not going to agree to a peace plan that Ukraine would agree to. There's no sense of consensus building or concessions by the Russians in any communications over the last 3.5 years. So from my perspective, this is the normal Russian behavior.
And I did want to share this with our viewers right here. This is via Fox News from Lieutenant Colonel Jeff Tolbert saying the talks are going well and we remain optimistic. Secretary Driscoll is closely synchronized with the White House and the U.S. interagency as these talks progress. Language is always so important with these delicate negotiations. Ambassador Taylor, you were hearing from Rear Admiral Montgomery stating that, Russia really has given no indication that they will acquiesce. When we take a look at the reality of a possible peace plan, how optimistic are you?
Well, I'm more optimistic now than I was a week ago, Stephanie. And I think the Admiral's exactly right. It's going to take pressure. The only way the Russians are going to come to agree to something like this is pressure. And we've put some pressure. President Trump put some tariffs and sanctions on the two largest Russian oil companies. And that's already had an effect of reducing the flow of revenue of rubles going into the treasury in Moscow, which is how they fund the war. So that's had an effect. More pressure needs to come. But then with the Ukrainians and the Americans and the Europeans united, that can happen.
So when we're talking about pressure, though, there are two types of pressure. There's rhetoric and there's action. When we're taking a look at all those involved, Ukraine, Russia, the United States, and the European allies, we've already seen some of that diplomatic pressure in terms of tariffs. Rear Admiral Montgomery, what kind of pressure do you think that Russia would respond to?
Well, certainly not rhetoric. I think they need actual pressure on them. And, from my point of view, last Friday, I thought the Treasury Department was going to really put sanctions on the shadow fleet recipients, Turkey, India, China, but not in that order, China, India, Turkey, in terms of receiving it. That kind of pressure, again, just as Ambassador mentioned, it cuts off rubles into the federal budget. And as most people know, the federal budget of Russia, 40% is spent on the war machine. So if you can cut that off, the other kind of pressure I would put on is I would announce like ATACMS transfers. That's a long range strike, 300-kilometer plus strike weapon that can be, when properly utilized, can be a very effective weapon for separating Russian command and control and logistics from its forces. So it has a double benefit of slowing down the ongoing Russian onslaught and signaling to President Putin that we're serious.
And let's talk about the peace plan itself. We don't know yet specifically what the latest iteration of this peace plan looks like, but the original one that President Trump had initially presented included ceding land to Russia and limiting the size of Kyiv's military. Those had previously been deal breakers for Ukrainian President Zelensky. So as we see Ukraine accepting this latest version of the peace plan, what does that indicate to the both of you in terms of the seriousness that Ukraine has when it comes to ultimate peace?
So I would say that that the acceptance by the Ukrainians of this new proposal, not the old one that you just mentioned, Stephanie, is a very good sign. That is, I expect, and you're right, we haven't seen the details of that, but I expect that we will see the removal of the limitation on the size of the army. Certainly an increase in the limits on that, if it's even there. Also, the discussion about NATO. NATO was ruled out in the earlier version, and apparently is not ruled out in this one. So I think there has been good progress in making this a much more realistic a proposal for the Ukrainians, Americans, and Europeans.
I agree with that. I agree with everything the ambassador said, and I'd add that I hope to see no limitation on European ground forces as part of an assurance force in Ukraine after a ceasefire. I mean, Ukraine's going to need some kind of guarantee that this just isn't a break for Putin to recapitalize, remobilize his forces, and with his significantly larger economy and population, retool for another strike on Ukraine. One way to prevent that is, 10 to 20,000 European forces along the ceasefire line. I would say principally from the UK and France, but I'd leave that to the Europeans. The most important part is that they're not limited by any kind of agreement.
When do either of you anticipate, another major development in these discussions?
So I'd say that we're looking at a meeting here, maybe in Washington, with President Zelensky and President Trump, to go over these last couple of details, and they're going to be important details on how to deal with territories. President Zelensky will try to convince President Trump, and probably succeed, in not recognizing Russian claim to any of these territories. That is, the principle of the inviolability of borders and sovereignty for Ukraine will be important. And I think that discussion will happen in the next week or two.
And I would suggest that President Putin, when he hears what date that is, will try to call President Trump about 48 hours ahead of time and offer something, that causes President Trump to think, I'm there if I only concede this one more issue that President Putin wants. I mean, he will try to spoil that meeting, as he's tried to spoil almost every meeting between Zelensky and Trump. President Trump's got to have his guard up against that, because he has to know by now, after 8 months of being rope-a-doped by President Putin, that President Putin is not really committed to peace on anyone's terms other than his own, and in any way that doesn't, quote, resolve the longstanding issues that cause this, which is, Russian kind of disinformation about, that it would imply Ukraine had anything to do with the initiation of this conflict.
In terms of the military aspect, Rear Admiral, how fatigued are the Russian troops? Because I have to imagine, there's not an infinite amount, and they must be exhausted. This has been going on for 4 years. How much longer do you anticipate that they'd be able to last?
So I spent a lot of time with Ukrainians, and the Ukrainian troops are tired, but they, the more and more Ukrainian generals preserve their human capital. They preserve their troops, and they use mission command and other techniques to try their best. When you ask about Russian troops, they're not fatigued because they're dead, right? The Russians, basically are pushing 100 to 200,000 new recruits in a year. Excuse me, 200 to 300,000 new recruits in a year, and really all 300,000 either get killed or wounded, right? And then a new group comes, and so the real question is, how fatigued is the Russian population to this, meat grinder of combat, and how much more money can Putin put? He's paying really large enlistment bonuses and death bonuses to the soldiers and their families who are fighting and dying in this war.
Gentlemen, we appreciate you joining us here on Live Now from Fox. Certainly a lot of developments yet to come as Ukraine has agreed to this peace deal. We appreciate your expertise and your insight.
Thanks, Stephanie.
Thank you, Stephanie.
And before we step away for a break, just sharing this with you, this is from the Associated Press, saying calls for a peace deal came as Russia launched a wave of attacks on Ukraine's capital, Kyiv, overnight, with at least 7 people killed in strikes that hit city buildings and energy infrastructure. We have yet to hear from Russian officials on this potential peace plan, as Ukraine has agreed to a new version of the original 28-point peace plan that was presented by President Trump. European allies, Ukrainian officials, and the U.S. working very closely for days now to come to this point. We, of course, will share all of the developments as they happen. And also, before we go, I did want to share this. This is from Ukraine's Secretary of National Security and Defense Council, saying that we appreciate the productive and constructive meetings held in Geneva between the Ukrainian and U.S. delegations, as well as President Trump's steadfast efforts to end the war. Our delegations reached a common understanding on the core terms of the agreement discussed in Geneva, We now count on the support of our European partners in our further steps. We look forward to organizing a visit of Ukraine's president to the U.S. at the earliest suitable date in November to complete final steps and make a deal with President Trump. So we did want to share that with you.